Today, Monday, 4th December, we see increasing signs of panic in both Europe and in the United States amongst European governments and within the US government about the developing events, both in Ukraine, in fact, primarily in Ukraine, but also to some extent in the Middle East and indeed in other places too. Let me first of all, however, as I now traditionally do, turn to the situation in Ukraine and speak specifically about the panic that is happening there, both in Ukraine and in the West. But let me also do, as I also traditionally do, touch on the military developments. Now, we've actually had less concrete news about actual movements on the battle lines in the last couple of hours. Now, that's not a sign that movements are not taking place. In fact, there have been hints that there's been a major Russian advances in the Stepovoye area to the northwest of Avdiivka, beyond the railway track, though we have not yet been provided exact details, and it looks as if the accumulating Russian pressure on Avdiivka itself is intensifying. There's also been more reports that the Russians have now essentially cleared Marinka. However, we've not yet had confirmation of this from the Russian Defense Ministry. We'll just have to wait and see whether that confirmation does actually come within the next few hours or days. If it doesn't, it'll be a sign that the Ukrainians still have a presence in Marinka, though obviously not a significant one, at least not a significant one from the various accounts which I've seen. And last but not least, there's apparently been further advances by the Russians in the Bakhmut area. They've apparently consolidated control over the ground near the village of Bogdanovka, and there are reports also that the Russians are in fact preparing to attack Bogdanovka itself, to storm this village at some point over the course of the next few days. But in some ways, the most dramatic news, at least an eyewitness report about the nature of the fighting, has come from the Kherson front lines, from Krinky itself, from a Ukrainian soldier who fought in Krinky, in this bridgehead that the Ukrainians established on the Russian-controlled east bank of the Dnieper River. And this Ukrainian soldier, he's unidentified, has been in contact with the BBC, and he's given an absolutely devastating account of the nature of the fighting that's taking place there. Devastating from the Ukrainian perspective. Now, I would say that a couple of weeks ago, the BBC apparently managed to speak to some Russian soldiers. It's never entirely clear to what extent these reports of the contacts with Russian soldiers in the Kherson area were correct, but these reports did discuss, these accounts from the Russian soldiers did discuss the very first days of the fighting after the Ukrainians attempted to cross the Dnieper River. They suggested some confusion on the part of the Russian defenders and some disorganization. And that might explain the Russian military's decision to replace the commander, the Russian commander of the forces defending the East Bank in Kherson region, with Teplinsky, one of, as I said, one of the most capable Russian commanders. And we see from this Ukrainian account what his presence and the reorganization that he's conducted of Russian forces on the East Bank, we see what the results is now turning out to be. And as I said, this is a devastating picture. So I'm going to quote all of the Ukrainian soldier's words. He says this: "The entire river crossing is under constant fire. I've seen boats with my comrades on board just disappear into the water after being hit, lost forever to the Dnieper River. We must carry everything with us: generators, fuel and food. When you're setting up a bridgehead, you need a lot of everything. But supplies weren't planned for this area. We thought after we made it there, that the enemy would flee and we could then calmly transport everything we needed. But it didn't turn out that way." This has been a recurring story, by the way, ever since the start of Ukraine's counteroffensive on the 4th of June. Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian officers, perhaps even Ukrainian generals, expecting that the Russians would flee in the face of Ukrainian advances, and dismayed and left without preparations and plans, when instead the Russians stood their ground and fought. And the Ukrainian soldier then goes on to say, "When we arrived on the eastern bank, the enemy were waiting. Russians we managed to capture, said their forces were tipped off about our landing. So when they got there, they knew exactly where to find us. They threw everything at us: artillery, mortars and flamethrower systems. I thought I'd never get out. Every day we sat in the forest taking incoming fire. We were trapped. The roads and paths are riddled with mines. The Russians cannot control everything, and we use it. But their drones are constantly buzzing in the air, ready to strike as soon as they see movement. Supplies were the weakest link. The Russians monitored our supply lines, so it became more difficult. There was a real lack of drinking water, despite our deliveries by boat and drone. We paid for a lot of our own kit, buying generators, power banks, and warm clothes ourselves. Now the frosts are coming. Things will only get worse. The real situation is being hushed up, so no one will change anything." And then come perhaps the bitterest words in this whole message. "No one knows the goals. Many believe that the command simply abandoned us. The guys believed that our presence had more political than military significance, but we just did our job and didn't get into strategy. Mostly our losses were mistakes. Someone didn't climb in that trench quickly enough. Another guy hid badly. If someone isn't switched on, he'll be immediately targeted from everywhere. But thanks to our doctors, if we can get an injured soldier to the medics, he'll be saved. They, in other words, the doctors are titans, gods. But we can't get the remains of the fallen out. It's just too dangerous. At the same time, our drones and missiles inflict a lot of losses on the enemy. We took prisoners once, but where to put them? If we have no way to cross the river, even with our injured comrades. Several brigades were supposed to be posted here, not individual companies. We just don't have enough men. There are a lot of young guys amongst us. We need people, but trained people, not the green ones we have there now. There are guys who just spent 3 weeks in training and only managed to shoot a few times. It's a total nightmare. A year ago, I wouldn't have said that, but now, sorry, I'm fed up. Everyone who wanted to volunteer for war came a long time ago. It's too hard now to tempt people with money. Now we're getting those who didn't manage to escape the draft. You laugh at this, but some of our Marines can't even swim. I got out after getting concussed from a mine, but one of my colleagues didn't make it. All that was left of him was his helmet. I feel like I escaped from hell, but the guys who replaced us last time got into the hell even more than us. But the next rotation is due. My time to cross the river again is soon. Well, there you have it. Russian-Ukrainian troops trapped in what is clearly now a fire sack. Expectations that the Russians would break as soon as the river crossing was effected have failed to be fulfilled. Expectations that Ukraine would be able to move entire brigades across the Dnieper, also unsuccessful. Some time ago, Sladko, the governor of Kherson region, said that the original Ukrainian plan was to capture Novaya Kharkovka by the 15th of November and then move on to Genishek by the Black Sea by mid-December. Well, this commentary by this Ukrainian soldier strongly suggests that Sladko was right, and we see how instead the Ukrainians have been bottled up in this tiny bridgehead in Krinky. The Russians are bombarding it relentlessly. They've trapped the Ukrainian soldiers there. They're able to interrupt Ukrainian supplies. The Ukrainians are outnumbered. They're massively outgunned. The Russians are able to monitor everything that they do, and in effect, they are trapped. And the Ukrainian soldier himself is questioning the entire logic of maintaining this bridgehead. He says that the soldiers who are there, between themselves, they think that this is serving only political and, in effect, PR objectives rather than military strategic ones. He thinks clearly that this battle is pointless. He sees it as essentially hell, a nightmare, and he says that he himself is fed up. He also talks about enormously heavy losses, about the Ukrainians having to abandon the bodies of their fallen comrades, and about the fact that he clearly feels deep dismay about the fact that he's going to have to cross the river again, probably facing the high likelihood of his own death. And I suspect that if you were to speak to Ukrainian soldiers in other places, in Avdiivka, for example, the men of the 110th Brigade holding out in Avdiivka itself, you'd find them, all of them, talking in much the same way. They're massively outgunned by the Russians. The Russians have huge amounts of artillery that they can bring to bear. The Russians have an operating air force. They're swamping Ukraine in terms of the drone war. The Russians have abundant supplies of artillery and equipment, and the Ukrainians have none of these things. They're running short of absolutely everything, including trained men, as this Ukrainian soldier says. And in recent programs, I've also discussed the absolutely appalling conditions, weather-wise, that the Ukrainian soldiers in Krinky must be facing. The fact that they're unable to keep warm, that they're getting uncertain supplies of food and water and of proper clothing. And we see that this soldier himself is now talking with a foreboding about the coming of the frosts. Now, having said all of that, it's clear that Ukrainian soldiers are still resisting. We're not yet talking about a collapse, a Ukrainian collapse, all across the front lines. But the level of pressure that they are now experiencing, not just in one or two locations. I remember reading similar commentaries from Ukrainian soldiers. For example, at the time of the Battle of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk in the summer of 2022, I remember reading commentaries like this from Ukrainian soldiers during the period of the Battle of Bakhmut. The key point, the key difference between those earlier commentaries and the situation now is that you're seeing the same thing play out right across the front lines. Everywhere the Ukrainians are on the strategic defense. Effectively, this is what this Ukrainian soldier tells us. That is the situation in Krinky, the one place where the Ukrainians imagined that they might win the initiative. Right across the front lines, Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian troops are under extreme pressure, as the Russian pressure right across the front lines builds. Now, in a couple of videos, I've made certain comparisons about between the conflict in Ukraine and the American Civil War, and how that played out, how the United States waged against Ukraine, waged against the Confederacy, what was in effect an attrition war, and how the Confederacy became ultimately exhausted, leading to individual commanders, Confederate commanders, like General Lee, deciding that the situation had become impossible and taking the initiative into their own hands and agreeing terms of surrender with the Union Army. Well, as I vaguely recall, and this is a long time since I studied that war, but I vaguely recall that the US at that time, the US military commanders, spoke about the United States conducting against the Confederacy what they called an anaconda strategy, slowly constricting, choking the Confederacy to death. And we can see something not so different playing out, or so it seems to me, in Ukraine at the moment. Anyway, another big difference with those previous battles, the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk battle in the summer of 2022, the fighting in Bakhmut, and the situation now, is that there is a general awareness in European capitals, the realization, if you like, that the war in Ukraine is being lost, that the Russians are winning, and there is almost nothing that can be done to turn the situation round. Now, we're starting to get dribbles of information from Ukrainian sources. These are the various Ukrainian telegram channels, especially Resident and Legitimi, both of which, for the record, I believe are closely connected to General Zaluzhny, just saying, but also Strana as well. Anyway, we're beginning to get dribbles of information both about the shifts in Ukrainian public opinion, I'll come to that shortly, but also, perhaps most interestingly, about the results of General Lloyd Austin's recent visit to Kiev. Interestingly, there is far less at the moment being said about the secret visit or semi-secret visit of the CIA director, William Burns, just a few short time before. But Lloyd Austin was in Kiev, and he met with Zelensky and he met with other Ukrainian officials, including the new Ukrainian defense minister, Rustem Umerov. And the general picture that we are getting from these reports is that Lloyd Austin gave a clear warning to President Zelensky and the political leaders in Kiev, to Zelensky's team, in other words, that General Zaluzhny continues to have the backing of the United States. And as I discussed in a program a short couple of days ago, even as rumors about Zaluzhny and his position swirl in Ukraine, General Brown, the new chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Armed Forces of the United States, was careful to have a telephone call with General Zaluzhny at the same time as President Zelensky was meeting with all the other military officials, but apparently excluding Zaluzhny from the discussions. So the Americans are signaling through Lloyd Austin and to some extent through General Brown their continued support for Zaluzhny. And apparently the Americans warned the Ukrainians that if Zaluzhny is sacked, it will not go down well in the United States, and it will not go down well in Europe either. And a sacking of Zaluzhny might affect the supply of US aid to Ukraine, Western aid generally, to Ukraine. Now, we don't know what the Ukrainians, what Zelensky and his people said in response to all of that, but we have heard that they did make one specific request of Lloyd Austin. Now, let me stress, this is not confirmed. This is all coming from Ukrainian Telegram channels. But for the record, I think it is probably true. Apparently, Ukraine asked Zelensky, or at least the Zelensky government, asked Lloyd Austin for the United States and the European powers, the West, the collective West, to supply Ukraine with 17 million shells, artillery shells. 17 million. Now, this at a time when the European Union has proved unable to supply Ukraine with the 1 million shells that it promised, when European warehouses are apparently empty, European stocks of shells have become catastrophically depleted. This a couple of months after the United States gave up attempts to supply 150 millimeter unitary shells to Ukraine and had to supply cluster munitions instead because they were short of shells. And when, according to reports, US production of 155 millimeter shells is currently running at 28,000 a month. And there were reports that I saw, again some days ago, that there is such an extreme shell shortage in the West that the United States has now had to go to Greece and is trying to negotiate with Greece for Greece to supply 75,000 shells to Ukraine, 75,000, and the United States will pay for them. From what I understand, 2/3 of these shells are not 155mm shells. They are 105mm shells. They're much lighter, but anyway, the United States, faced with this shell shortage, is being asked to supply by the Ukrainians, if this report is true, which, by the way, I suspect it is, with 17 million shells. We don't know what Lloyd Austin's reaction would have been if he did receive a request like this, but Ukrainian telegram channels told us that he did. I suspect that he must have said to himself that the Ukrainians are taking leave of their senses. Since then, he's returned to the United States, Lloyd Austin has, and he's made a speech. He made a speech at the Reagan Center where he apparently said that the United States intends to quadruple shell production by comparison with the levels it was at the start of the Ukrainian conflict. At the start of the Ukrainian conflict, by most estimates, the United States was producing 14,000 shells a month. Some reports say it was lower than that, just 12,000 shells a month. If the United States, assuming the United States is producing, did in fact produce 14,000 shells a month at the time that the conflict began, then we're looking at a total of perhaps 55 to 60,000 shells a month. That apparently is the current target now. That, of course, doesn't remotely come close to the 17 million shells that Zelensky and his people asked the United States for. I have to say that this request, if it actually was made, seems so outlandish that I can't help but think that it was not made by the Ukrainians with any true expectation that the Americans would comply with it. It was made by the Ukrainians to stress a political point, one which you're already increasingly seeing in commentaries by Ukrainian officials. They're starting to hint increasingly that they were led by the West up the garden path, exactly as Professor Mearsheimer has said, that the West made astonishing promises of unlimited military support to Ukraine before, especially at the time when the negotiations with the Russians last year appeared to bear fruit, and the United States and Britain played the leading role in curtailing those negotiations and making Ukraine go back on the agreements with the Russians that it had reached. And what the Ukrainians are now working towards doing, as they face the prospect of military defeat, is of blaming that defeat on the failure of the Americans and the British to fulfill their promises of unlimited support, which the Americans and the British made to Ukraine. That's my guess. But anyway, an extraordinary trip altogether, but we see that the United States is inserting itself, or trying to insert itself, according to these Ukrainian telegram channels, in Ukrainian domestic politics. It is interfering in President Zelensky's attempts to shore up his political position. And if it is indeed the case, as again I think is almost certainly true, that the US is overtly backing Zelensky, then that is an ominous sign for President Zelensky. Now, Zelensky himself is coming for increasing criticism in Ukraine. There's more reports in Ukraine which appear to support the reality of the conversation between Poroshenko and Akhmetov, the two Ukrainian oligarchs, one of whom, Poroshenko, was of course previously Ukraine's president, but the two Ukrainian oligarchs who appear to have been overheard in a conversation discussing a potential coup against President Zelensky. We've now had open talk about a coup by Zelensky's former chief spokesman, Alexei Arestovich, who's now clearly gone over to the side of the coup plotters, if I can so describe them. Arestovich is now talking about the need to carry out a complete reconstitution of the government. He says this has to happen either through a constitutional legal process, a process of consent, or he says some kind of a coup. He talks about a constitutional coup. I'm not quite sure what he means by that, but anyway, he says that there will have to be some constitutional coup if consent is not provided. And then the alternative is another Maidan, the streets filling up with protesters, protesting against President Zelensky, working, in other words, to bring him down in the same way that President Yanukovych was brought down back in 2014, leading to the change of power which altered Ukraine's political trajectory and which continues to influence events in Ukraine ever since. So we can see that all of these plots, all these discussion plots in Ukraine continues. And we've also now had more comments from these Ukrainian Telegram channels, Resident and Legitimy, which, as I say, I believe are controlled or connected to Zelensky in some form. But anyway, these sort of Telegram channels all tell us the same thing, that Zelensky has been effectively cut out of all military decision-making, that Zelensky picks and chooses which military commanders he will communicate with, that he doesn't communicate any longer with Zelensky, that Zelensky speaks to officers going over Zelensky's head, that Zelensky is not informed of the decisions that Zelensky is taking, and that he often finds that, for example, attacks in various places are taking place without his knowledge, without the military commanders who've been ordered to conduct these attacks, reporting the fact in advance to Zelensky himself. And the Telegram channels, Resident, Legitimy, complain that this has resulted in a complete collapse of the chain of command, that the result is that nobody really knows exactly what is going on, that different parts of the military are responding to different orders from different officials, from those aligned with Zelensky in one case, those aligned to Zelensky in the other case. And I've noticed that again, General Syrskyi, the commander of the ground forces, the person who has previously been in charge of the fighting in Bakhmut, but who is now also trying to run things in Kupiansk and Liman, that he's now increasingly being spoken of as President Zelensky's favorite, in a way that suggests that General Zaluzhny once more is starting to see Syrskyi as a potential rival. So, chaotic situation in Kiev, the United States backing Zaluzhny, giving warnings to Zelensky not to sack Zaluzhny, but Zelensky still working to undermine Zaluzhny and probably still planning eventually to sack him, perhaps once Avdiivka has fallen, but also, it seems, extremely worried about Zaluzhny's popularity. And there was another report that appeared yesterday in which supposedly President Zelensky told an American official, presumably General Austin, that he has no real objection to elections being held next year, that he would be happy to conduct those elections, but only on the condition that General Zaluzhny did not participate in them. And the reason for that is that opinion polls now conclusively show Zaluzhny as a more popular figure than Zelensky himself. And by the way, the opinion polls, some of them now discussed by Strana, tell us of a significant shift on the part of the Ukrainian public, with more and more Ukrainians, including in the West, now gradually coming round to the view that war until victory, what Zelensky is still promising, is unachievable, and that Ukraine should instead settle for a compromise peace. So, a complex situation in Ukraine. We still don't fully know where all of this is heading. Zelensky remains the constitutional president. My own view is that his meeting with the military leaders last week was an attempt to shore up support in advance of a showdown with Zaluzhny. We have all of those Ukrainian MPs still criticizing and sniping at Zaluzhny, and I'm confident that they've been put up to do that by Zelensky and his team. So all of that is continuing. I think that Zelensky probably had to promise the generals, Tarnavsky, Syrskyi, and the others, that once Zaluzhny is sacked, in return for their support, he will agree to what looks like their demand, that Ukraine go on to the defensive, which is why he gave that, made that broadcast talking about the building up of fortifications and that sort of thing. But I still think that we're heading for a showdown. Zelensky, as I said, remains the constitutional president. He might still have the residual loyalty of some people within the military. Perhaps General Syrskyi, who may be angling to take over from Zaluzhny, his long-term rival, is backing Zelensky in this quarrel. Perhaps other generals also are. Zaluzhny still has the backing of the United States, but it's all very well for people like Arestovich and Poroshenko to talk about mounting a coup in Kiev. But how exactly do you do that and retain control of the political process thereafter? On balance, I still think that Zelensky, provided he plays his cards with a modicum of skill, is at an advantage over his adversaries, and I suspect that after Avdiivka falls, perhaps in the early weeks of next year, he will finally act to lance this boil, and that Zaluzhny himself will be sacked, with perhaps Syrskyi taking his place. Anyway, that's where we are. A complex, disastrous, and unsatisfactory picture. A growing crisis along the battlefronts, in every part of the battlefronts now. A growing political crisis in Kiev, the United States trying to insert itself in that crisis, backing Zaluzhny against Zelensky, but Zelensky apparently increasingly determined to move on and to shore up his position by sacking Zaluzhny and talking to military officers behind Zaluzhny's back. President Zelensky's wife, by the way, recently gave an interview in which she said that she does not want her husband to stand again for the presidency. She wants him to go into retirement after his term ends. My own suspicion is that what she's actually telling President Zelensky now is that he should actually step down, and that is her advice, and perhaps even her pleas to him. She's presumably aware of all the plotting and conspiring and intrigue that's going on, and of the gathering crisis in the battlefronts, and of the loss of support for Zelensky in the United States. But for the moment, at least, all the signs are that Zelensky continues to, in his determination, to cling on. Perhaps he's afraid of the reaction of members of his own entourage, were he to take steps to step down. Perhaps he's worried about his future, his long-term future, if he did step down, given that Ukraine has a culture of political violence. But anyway, one way or the other, it does seem to me as if Zelensky is going to disregard the warnings of the United States. It's heading to sack Zaluzhny and is trying to buy the support of some Ukrainian commanders before he does that. So, a deteriorating military picture, a crisis in Kiev, all of them, both of them, steadily coming to a head. And there is now panic, as I said at the start of the program, in Washington and in Europe as well. And let me start with Europe, because we've now had perhaps one of the most extreme manifestations of that panic in some utterly astonishing, indeed bizarre comments made by the former German foreign minister, Joschka Fischer, who was once the leader of the Green Party and Gerhard Schröder's coalition partner, and who in the past, by the way, was a militant left-wing activist in Germany in the 1960s and 1970s. There were even untrue allegations that he had some kind of connections to agencies like the Rote Army Faction. I want to stress, I believe those allegations to be wholly untrue. But I've even been told in person from various people that he did have those links. As I said, I am sure that those claims are wrong. But anyway, Joschka Fischer, a person with a long history in left-wing activism, anti-military activism. Anyway, he now says this. He says that we must restore our deterrent capability. And this was also to cite online. And then he went on to say that though he doesn't like the idea at all, as long as we have a neighbor, Russia, that follows Putin's imperial ideology, we cannot do without deterring Russia. And then the question was put to him, does that mean that Germany should acquire its own nuclear weapons? And then Joschka Fischer responded to this is indeed the most difficult question. Should Germany have nuclear weapons? No. Europe, yes. The EU needs its own nuclear deterrent. The world has changed, and Putin is also working with nuclear blackmail. Now this, from someone who, as I remember, in the early 1980s, at a time when the Green Party was led by people like Petra Kelly, long since deceased and long since forgotten, by the way. Well, at that time, of course, the Greens were opposed to nuclear weapons on principle. They campaigned against the deployment of American nuclear weapons, Tomahawk and Pershing II nuclear weapons in Germany. They were, of course, also opposed to civil nuclear power, as, by the way, they still are. Well, Joschka Fischer, who presumably was in full support at that time of all these positions of the Greens, all the way back then in the 1980s, during the Cold War, when the Russians, of course, were physically present on German territory. Their troops were in Berlin and along the Elbe River. Anyway, Joschka Fischer, today, he wants not Germany, of course, but the EU to convert itself into an outright military alliance and become a nuclear power to boot. He wants the EU to acquire nuclear weapons. He says that he doesn't like the idea at all, but this has to happen because Russia, under Putin, has an imperial ideology, and Europe needs deterrence, and apparently the United States can no longer be fully relied upon. I have to say that these are astonishing words, and they demonstrate not just the transformation of the Greens, that is the least of it, but the growing realization in Germany, in Brussels, in the European Union, in Britain too, by the way, that the war in Ukraine is being lost, that this massive investment of men and machines and money that Germany poured into Ukraine, that the sacrifice of the Nord Stream pipelines, of the entire architecture of economic and political cooperation with Russia in support of Project Ukraine is ending in catastrophic failure, that there is a growing risk that in the aftermath of this disaster, the Americans might one day pull away. So what do? We, the anti-nuclear campaigners of the past, have now learnt to love the bomb and have decided that we have to acquire it in order to keep these Russians at bay. We no longer have any confidence in our own military. We've had a whole discussion about it in Germany. I discussed this again yesterday in my program, that the German army, the German military historian, is saying that the Russians marched on Europe, the European militaries would crumble ahead of their advance, just like the armies of the Holy Roman Empire, the German states did in the face of the advance of Napoleon. So, in light of all of this, in light of the imminent and pending defeat in Ukraine, well, let's get ourselves some nuclear weapons. And when we talk about Putin engaging in nuclear blackmail, of course, what we're really going to do is engage in nuclear blackmail against the Russians of our own. We're going to tell the Russians, don't have any ideas of advancing on us, because if you do, well, we will use nuclear weapons against you. Now, let me say at once that this is a catastrophic idea. It is a disastrous idea. Quite apart from the fact that the EU converting itself into a nuclear power, a nuclear military power, will transform the relationship of the EU, not just with member states, but to the world generally. It's difficult to imagine anything more likely to provoke the Russians than Germany acquiring nuclear weapons. And given that the Russians rightly consider that when it comes to the EU, it is the Germans who effectively run the EU, the Russians will undoubtedly see Fischer's scheme as a clever device, or perhaps a not so clever device, for Germany to obtain nuclear weapons, but to do so under the pretense that these nuclear weapons belong to the EU. And of course, if Germany acquires nuclear weapons, it won't just provoke the Russians, it will provoke other countries. And it's most unlikely, for example, that the Poles, who already have a complex relationship with the EU at multiple levels, will be happy, even if that German deterrent is purportedly an EU one. Acquiring nuclear weapons in that way is more likely to increase pressure for Poland to pull out of the EU. Poland might, in that case, acquire nuclear weapons of its own. It has the abilities to do that. And of course, the entire architecture of nuclear non-proliferation, of strategic defense, of strategic arms limitation, constructed following President Kennedy's peace speech of 1963, will have once and for all and finally completely broken down. As I said, this is a calamitous idea, but we can see where panic and desperation amongst Western leaders, European leaders, is taking them. But we also see growing signs of panic in the United States. Firstly, the administration is now going around warning everybody that unless Congress provides funding to Ukraine before the end of this year, then American aid to Ukraine will have to stop. Shalanda Young, who is the White House's budget director, who presumably should be busy worrying about the fact that the United States budget deficit is in effect running entirely out of control. Anyway, she's now written a letter to congressional leaders. She says that without congressional action, by the end of the year, we will run out of resources to procure more weapons and equipment for Ukraine and to provide equipment from US military stocks. There is no magical pot of funding available to meet this moment. We are out of money and nearly out of time. Cutting off the flow of US weapons and equipment will kneecap Ukraine on the battlefield, not only putting at risk the gains Ukraine has made, which gains, but increasing the likelihood of Russian military victories. Already our packages of security assistance have become smaller and the deliveries of aid have become more limited, while our allies around the world have stepped up to do more. Which allies? Germany to some extent, certainly not any of the others. US support is critical and cannot be replicated by others, which is of course true. And then she goes on to say that the Ukrainian economy is now on the brink of collapse. If Ukraine's economy collapses, because the United States withdraws economic support, they will not be able to keep fighting, full stop. Putin understands this well, which is why Russia has made destroying Ukraine's economy central to its strategy, which you can see in Russia's attacks against Ukraine's grain exports and energy infrastructure. While we cannot predict and then she goes on with the story about how supplying aid, unlimited financial aid to Ukraine is somehow beneficial to the American economy. An idea which I find so objectionable that I'm not going to explore it in this program so that I can keep my temper. But anyway, there we go. So the Biden White House now signaling that unless they get an appropriation from Congress within the next few weeks, Ukraine is going to start spiraling downward, descending into deeper crisis. But there's been a further article, which appears in the Financial Times, by Gideon Rachman, one of the Financial Times' most long-standing commentators and opinion writers, and somebody who is, or at least he gives the impression of being, quite close to the thinking of the Biden White House. And he starts this article, which begins, America and a crumbling global order. How many international conflicts can one superpower handle at the same time? And he goes on to say that the United States, the administration, is currently trying to deal with wars in the Middle East and Europe, whilst preparing for a surge in tensions between China and Taiwan. And all this is taking place under the lengthening shadow of Donald Trump. And he goes on to say, the combination of all of these events is creating a palpable sense of tension and foreboding in government offices in Washington. It is not just the sheer number of crises coming at the Biden administration, but the fact that many are heading in the wrong direction. The wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, for example, and the polls look bad for Biden. And then Gideon Rachman quotes a senior US official who he's clearly been talking about and who perhaps is the person who has inspired this article. Anyway, this official says, the next 3 months could determine the next few years. And another person who Gideon Rachman has been talking to, a prominent Democrat, worries that, quote, by January, we could be talking about how Joe Biden lost Ukraine. So we then go on to read the precariousness of America's Ukraine situation is getting less attention than it should because of the Middle East. The United States, the Biden administration is paying a heavy political price at home and abroad for its support for Israel. The United States is putting pressure on Israel to change its military tactics in Gaza. However, they're becoming frustrated by the fact that the Israelis aren't listening to them. They're also continue to be worried about the problems of an escalating war. They're also deeply worried that the recent summit meeting in San Francisco clearly did not sort out the problems with the United States and China. They expect that Lai Ching-te, who is regarded in Beijing as a dangerous separatist, I'm reading this again from Gideon Rachman's article, is likely to win the elections in Taiwan, and that this could result in growing tensions between China and Taiwan, military tensions between China and Taiwan. And they say that Gideon Rachman says that American officials believe that China is closely watching Ukraine and Gaza, and that all of the crises are linked. By the way, this is something that people who feel themselves to be under pressure often think. They imagine that everybody is ganging up against them. It's a classic paranoia symptom. And we then hear that Western officials, this is again from Gideon Rachman, in other words, American officials, believe Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea are working together much more closely than before. The Russians are now dependent on Chinese economic support and are almost unrestrained in military collaboration with North Korea and Iran. And with the US presidential election less than a year away, all these international crises feed into American politics. Trump will take every opportunity to accuse Biden of presiding over an era of weakness and retreat, citing Afghanistan, Ukraine, Gaza, and Taiwan. And a chaotic and divisive US election, with Trump as the central figure, will contribute powerfully to the impression of US weakness and decline. And China, Russia, and Iran will relish asking how America can defend democracies overseas when its own democracy is in so much trouble at home. So, we see, well, clear signs of panic in Washington too. Of course, Gideon Rachman doesn't use those words, but we are told that there is now a palpable sense of tension and foreboding in government offices in Washington. And it's absolutely clear what is worrying them most. What is worrying them most is the situation in Ukraine. A prominent Democrat, has told Gideon Rachman, by January, we could be talking about how Joe Biden lost Ukraine. They're worried they can't get the funding from Congress fast enough, that there is no money left to spend for Ukraine. The military situation in Ukraine is going disastrously wrong. There is a political crisis in Ukraine. Zelensky is working to sack Zaluzhny. That's going to undermine the case in Washington for more funding from Ukraine even further, putting aside the effect of what it might have in terms of the morale of the Ukrainian military itself. But note again the glaring absence of any political strategy to find a way out of this conflict. There is no suggestion here in this article by Gideon Rachman of the United States trying to engage the Russians in some kind of diplomatic initiative, taking some step to try and find a modus vivendi with the Russians, an attempt to agree with the Russians, some kind of security arrangements in Europe, which might just possibly bring this whole situation back under control. Instead, we read all kinds of concerns, we read about panic. There's even, I saw somewhere today, reports that the administration is worried that by the end of next year, by 2024, even as Ukraine itself collapses, there are people in the White House who apparently believe in all seriousness that by the end of 2024, the Russians, Putin, might be threatening the Baltic states. That Putin and the Russians have given not a single sign of planning to do any such thing is apparently, neither here nor there. In this panicky, nervous atmosphere, in this atmosphere of tension and foreboding, there are worries that might be what will come. And looming behind it all, there is the even greater fear that a military debacle in Ukraine and tensions in Taiwan and a continuing crisis in the Middle East, all of that ultimately might play to the advantage of Donald Trump in the election. But no plan, no idea what to do, no thought of negotiations or talks with the Russians. It's the classic situation, the famous image of the rabbit caught in the headlights of the oncoming car. That's exactly the mood in Washington. The mood in Washington, deep foreboding and tension. The mood in Germany, panic, reaching, in the case of Joschka Fischer, for nuclear weapons as the way out of the problems. Well, it's difficult, frankly, to know what more to say about this. I still think that crossing the bridge in terms of nuclear weapons for Germany and for the EU, well, I still think we're some distance away, thankfully, from that kind of position. And as for the administration, well, it's unwise, it's reckless actions, it's misreading of the international situation in Europe, in Russia, in the Middle East, have all brought about the foreign policy disaster that is looming over the horizon. There are actually things it could do. And as I've said many times, talking to the Russians, discussing with them what to do would be the first step. There's a report that I've seen that Henry Kissinger, about whom, by the way, we've done a program, we've discussed his record on the Duran, Alex Christoforo and I, you can read it all there. Anyway, Henry Kissinger apparently his very last words of advice, or rather of concern, was that there's been this total breakdown of communication between the White House and the Kremlin, between the United States and the Russians. And he called urgently for a resumption in those contacts. And that, it seems to me, is what logically should happen. There should be a call to Moscow for the US to receive an American emissary, perhaps Bill Burns. Perhaps Bill Burns could go to Moscow and have proper talks there with the Russians to see what the Russians actually are thinking. They're giving all kinds of hints about what they want to see happen in Ukraine, but at least find out what the Russians are thinking. Don't do what I have to do at the Duran, which is try to interpret Russian intentions by analysing, by parsing Putin's words. Perhaps Bill Burns going to Moscow in that kind of spirit, he might be able to speak to top Russian leaders, to Lavrov, as well as SVR chief Narishkin. Perhaps, who knows, he might be even admitted to a meeting with Putin himself, and the Russians might explain their thinking to the Americans, and the Americans might then at least have some idea of how to respond, hopefully constructively, and see a way forward to move with the Russians towards bringing this whole thing under control. But no sign of that. Lots of talk about foreboding, about gloom, more attempts to get more money from Congress. Not that that's going to change anything. Ukraine has received hundreds of billions of dollars of funding from the US, and despite all that funding, it's now visibly losing the war. The United States cannot conjure up out of thin air more trained Ukrainian fighters to turn the tide round in the war, nor can it provide Ukraine with the 17 million shells that Ukraine supposedly asked for. So, the solution is in American hands. It's incredible that they're not doing it. And I am not surprised that the old monster, Henry Kissinger, in his dying words, apparently, remembering, of course, times past when the United States and he himself did things differently. Well, it's not surprising that the old monster asked that simple question, why? Anyway, this is where I end my program today. More from me soon. I suspect that by tomorrow we'll be getting lots more information from the Ukrainian battlefronts, and we'll see we get further ideas about where all this is going. Thank you again for joining me again today. More from me soon. Let me remind you once more that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can find links under this video. You can check out our shop and buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. And if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.